Hello and welcome to a random live stream on a Saturday night. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and thank you to my what do you call it, a conversationalist. You're not exactly a co-host, are you? You're my you're joining me tonight anyway. Should I call you Phil or Philypocrite, or is it Philypocrite?
It's well, I say Philypocrite, but I've heard all sorts of different variations. So you can say Phil
I
if you want.
Phil,
Might
sure.
be easier.
I couldn't figure out how to spell it when I was putting your name in the title because I was like, I thought it was philo, like philosophy,
Hmm.
and then I just kept getting messed up. I was like, I know that's not right. I had to go look for your. Okay. I really should have put a link to your YouTube channel, but YouTube's not really your main thing that you do online. Is that right? Do you
Well,
want to
online.
Well, I don't
Yeah.
know. Well, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Philip. um, no, so I think online, I'd say my YouTube channel is probably my primary thing that I do. But I have also written a book, which is what this conversation is about.
Are you?
And
I forgot mine too.
yes, exactly. This is the new edition that's coming out on Monday, for which I'm really excited. And that's one of my main activities, I guess. Primarily, I'm just a student. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to tell me what you're studying, or is that private information?
No, I'm a theology student, and that's also what I speak about on my YouTube channel. It's mainly looking at the Bible in the original languages and trying to mine some of the linguistic kind of significance out of the ancient languages in which it was originally written. So that's what I do there. If anyone's interested, the channel has the same name as you see here. So if you've got difficulty spelling it, just copy that.
If you're watching this stream after the fact, I'm going to put a link in the description so that it'll be there. But for live viewers, I'm afraid you're going to have to stick around and watch the rest of this stream until you for the rest of the night, which suits me. So I don't know where to start really, but you've been studying theology, and your book is not explicitly Christian or religious, but it is religious in a kind of in another sense. So what you probably do better at explaining it than me. So how about you introduce? What is the House of Noth? Why did you write it? And what is it about?
Well, it's The House of Noth is a fantasy novel, I think. I think one can categorize it like that. I don't know
Yeah,
if it quite.
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Then that's what it is. Uh, and I wrote it because I was stuck in South Africa in a lockdown. I'm a South African natively, and yeah. So while I was stuck in a lockdown, and I couldn't move around that much. Actually, I could move around relatively freely, but I wasn't supposed to be. I decided to use the time to write a book. I've always wanted to write a fantasy novel. I've been doing a lot of like world building since as far back as I can remember, and I've always been curious about stories, especially more fantastical or mythological or fairy story type stories. And so I decided to sit down and write something. And it was originally supposed to be inspired by the Mongolian steppes, because I was watching a lot of YouTube videos on those at the time, and I'd read some about them. But it then eventually morphed and changed a little bit as time went on, and it's definitely got a much more, I don't know, Germanic flavor to it now, because that's also a big interest that I have.
Yeah, I heard. I'm sure most people know this already, but I heard that Tolkien wrote the Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings series because he was interested in linguistics and wanted to write his own language, and that the history that would require that language to come about was what he really wanted to write. It was this sort of fictional language and a fictional history, and to me that seems like a completely backwards way round of writing a story, but obviously it works. And it seems like you came at it from a kind of direction of wanting to talk about wanting to write about geography, if you're talking about the steps and history.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, it's interesting. I guess the world itself was something that fascinated me, but I think it's difficult to how do you say, separate these things from language for a human being. I think language is one of the fundamental mechanisms we use to understand the world, and so the language is definitely also the language that you use to write the story primarily. I think in Tolkien's case, it was obviously that he created languages, that they needed cultures, that they needed geography as well, and so on. But in my case, I think it was to some degree more my fascination with English, and with specifically also with Tolkien's English, that then led me to want to write stories in English specifically, but then also to experiment with language a little bit. So it's more of a literary experiment in that sense. But at the same time, it's difficult to divorce that from the philosophies that one develops as one is going through life, and also from theology in my case, because I think my way of understanding the world is fundamentally, primarily theological in nature. So some of that also bled into the story, but maybe in a more consequential way, and not with that wasn't like the primary focus that I had.
Well, did you want to talk about briefly why it is that I ended up reading your book, or why did you why did you send me a copy?
Yes, well, because you're an English-speaking person, so that was one reason. No, well, I came across your channel actually during the lockdown as well. There were a couple of things that happened. Firstly, I started a YouTube channel, and I was staying at home at my parents' house in South Africa because so the story, if I start at the relatively a bit earlier on, I started studying theology in Germany in 2018. And then when 2020 came around, I went back to South Africa to visit friends and family. And then while I was in South Africa visiting, the hard lockdown came, the first one. And I was staying at my parents' place. And then as time wore on, I still wasn't able to move back to Germany to carry on with my studies in person. So I carried on doing them online via correspondence. And in this time, I was staying in the same house as my parents and my sister, and I was writing this book. And I think after I'd written the first draft or something, I also got a bit fed up with just being in this lockdown and all of the COVID sort of news and so on. So I decided to start a YouTube channel where I could just explore the biblical texts in their original languages, which is how that happened. And then because I'd started a YouTube channel, I was starting to look into how other people had done it. And it was in this time that my sister pointed out a couple of the channels that are also often in conversation with yours, I think, amongst which is Luke's channel.
Yeah.
So Lambda Bible Studies is there as well. And so I was on Lambda Bible Studies, and I also came across yours, and I found it really interesting, just the journey that you'd gone through, and also the fact that you were speaking about Jordan Peterson quite a lot, and he also had a big influence on me, I think, in the last year of my studies before I moved to Germany. So I was also studying in South Africa before I went to Germany, and there I was consuming a lot of his videos and so on. So.
And then so it was through Luke that you that you sent me Luke just asked me if you could send me a book and get me your address, which may have been a little bit reckless of me to just give my address out to random people who want to send me a book, but it ended up very well. And I really liked your book when you sent it, even though I didn't know anything about you, and I guess I'm not that interested in theology, but I could kind of see what you were doing in trying to write a lot of wisdom into this story, while also making this very sort of rich world with its own, its own languages, its own peoples, its own kind of laws. I really appreciated that you weren't just using like a carbon, you weren't just using the standard framework of like, okay, there are dwarves, there are elves, there are orcs. It's like you're doing your own thing, but in with its favorite like Tolkien-esque flavor. And there was a lot of things I really enjoyed about that. With where you were taking it in this sort of rich history that the world has. So it was good. It was a good time getting lost in that story, and I appreciate that. But what I wanted to have you on here today to talk about, not just about the book specifically, but I think maybe is this your first novel? Can you remind me?
Yes, well, it's the first one that I've published. I wrote a book quite in like 2016 or something like that, which I don't think will be. I hope it doesn't ever get published because it was pretty bad, but it was a good exercise, and that was the first bigger literary project that I finished. But then, yeah, well, this was the second one, and this one is actually out there for people to read. So, well, it will be on Monday again.
Well, well, that would be great. I'd love for people who are watching this to go read your book, to buy it. And what I wanted to talk about is that process of wanting to write a book, like this idea of like starting to write it and writing down words, and how you get from that point to the point where it's actually finished and published and it's ready for people to read it. Because I think it's a really common experience for people who enjoy reading that they want to write something and they have an idea, like they have an idea for a story, or they have an idea of characters, or they have an idea of a world, and they work on these ideas, they map it all out, they start writing it, they do some work on it, and then somewhere along the line it just dies. They lose motivation, they no longer like the idea, and I guess I wanted to explore with you what it is that kind of motivates you, or just anyone, to go from not being an author to saying, yes, I am going to write a book, and then putting in the hours and hours and hours of work into writing something that you're not even sure anyone is going to enjoy or even read. So what was that like for you? If it was, I also wrote my book in lockdown, so but it wasn't like I had loads of spare time is the thing. It's not like I was going on parties and then suddenly I was locked down. I wasn't allowed to go out anymore. Like I had like a 6-month-old baby at the time, where I was like, I didn't have any time to do anything, and I still managed to write this book because I just had to. Was it the same for you, where you felt sort of compelled to finish it, or was it a slog?
No, I think I had the first draft of it, because it's gone through many different like revisions, even before it came out the first time. Now, obviously, it's been refined a bit further for this next edition. But I mean, the first version of it I wrote was like 100 pages long, I think, and I wrote it in a week. I think I just sat down and wrote almost all day, every day, and by the end, I had this story with which I was quite happy, although retrospectively I shouldn't have been. Yeah, so that was the first version of it. It was kind of this intense drive to just write a relatively short adventure that ended up not really being what I had intended at first, but I was happy that I'd finished it.
Okay, well, can I ask you a question then? That's really interesting. But the first 100 pages or so of this book are a little bit different from the rest, which makes me wonder if if that was what you wrote, like this little saga of. You'll really have to remind me because it's been a while since I've read it. But the bad monster thing that is sort of plaguing this community. Well, I don't want to spoil it, but the process of going through that part of the book, was that the first 100 pages that you wrote?
The first 100 pages of this version of the book are a very extended version of the first like 20 pages of the original book. So in the original book, a lot of similar things happen as one sees happening in the first 100 pages of this version of the book. But then after that similar beginning, the adventurers kind of go off into the world, but they went in a completely different direction. They went to a completely different location. It was just a completely different adventure. Because I simply had a different kind of setting in mind. And then when I decided to rewrite it, I realized my strengths lay more with Germanic kind of mythology and the way in which I'd explored the history of the English language and so on also made me realize it's probably wiser if I stick to the things that I know better. But I'd be curious to see what you made of what happens after the first 100 pages. If the story was noticeably different after that. You're on mute. Sorry.
Excuse me. When Luke asked me if I wanted to read this book, I didn't want you to send it to me without, and then it just to collect dust and not be read. So I went onto your Amazon page, which is no longer active, by the way. That's for viewers. And I read the sample, which is like the first chapter. And the sample was enough to hook me in to the point where I thought, like, I want to read this book. I want to read it if someone sends it to me for free, at the very least. So that little sort of, there was enough of a mystery there, like an expectation of interesting things to come, that I wanted to read it. And I think that's so important for the start of any story, where there's. I started to really obsess over this the more I was writing, like trying to keep something in every chapter that would keep the reader like thinking what was going to happen next, like wondering what was going to happen next, introducing new elements that were interesting. But I think you achieved that well. I guess I was a little bit surprised about the direction that the story went in after that little mystery at the beginning. I really loved that, and then to see that resolved, I was left kind of hanging a little bit, like, okay, then what? And then you introduce this new character at that point. Forgive me if I'm misremembering this, but there was the kind of princess character who's at that point has not been in the story at all, suddenly introduced. And that was enough then to pick me up again. I go, okay, well, this is a new thing. Like, I want to see what's going to happen with her. Because you had a lot of interesting plot elements there that were introduced at the same time. And that was great. And then after that, I guess it kind of just felt like something new, if that makes sense. I don't know how to describe it better than that. But I just want to pick up on something you said about the first draft. In a weird kind of coincidence, my first... Now let's see if I got this right. The first draft I wrote was about 10,000 words, which is technically a novella, I think. The current the one that actually got published now that you can go and buy or go listen to an audiobook is 120 pages. But at the time, it wasn't even enough pages to be submitted to a publisher. I looked up a few publishers who would take submissions without an agent, and I found one that looked like they would be suited for this kind of book, and they didn't want to publish it just purely because there weren't enough pages in it, and it was too short, which I thought was a real shame. Or maybe they just didn't like it and they were being polite. Who knows? But that spirit, the ancients used to talk about a muse, the kind of the spirit of creativity. Of doing something artistic that I found very motivating. Like the idea that this story sort of came into my head, and the more I thought, as soon as I had the idea, I thought about it more, and the more I thought about it, the more it started just coming and coming. Like more and more bits of it started falling into place, and I was sort of just compelled to put it down onto paper. And then once it was down on paper, I was really I was so like excited by it, like the idea that I had written something and it was finished, and I really just wanted people to read it. I was so like, I don't know, maybe it's just a sense of ego. Maybe you can talk about that, but I was so eager just for people to read it. I didn't care if they paid for it or if they, if they got famous or whatever. I just wanted someone to read what I read because I thought it was just that good. Is that how you felt?
Yeah, it's happened. I think it happens to me on a regular basis because I'm quite artistically active, I think, at least in my private life. Like I like to draw things or write things, even short stories and so on. So or make videos. So whenever I've completed something, I tend to get this rush of like, I've done a thing. I want to see what people think about it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it seems to be a common thing for artists to, after they've created an artwork, to put it into a public space and to have it be critiqued, at least. Maybe there's some kind of a rush you get out of potentially being absolutely destroyed for what you've done, and then it doesn't happen. But yeah, there is something about communicating with people via a medium. I think that's that's very satisfying, especially if you try to do something very complicated and it's successful. And I don't know if there's something like that lies behind it as well.
Yeah, the strange thing is that whenever I'm finished making a YouTube video, I often have the feeling of wanting just to delete it and not upload it. Like I go through all the effort of like filming it, and then I edit it, and I think that video wasn't actually that good. Like I kind of just don't want to post it. I've never actually done that. I think I've done that a few times, but I very rarely do I leave something just unlisted, or I always end up posting it, and then people say they like it, so I'm glad that I ended up posting it. But it is weird that this much more intensive medium of writing inspired me with this desire for people to read it. Whereas if I do a drawing, you're also a kind of illustrator. You did the illustrations for House of Noth, which I also enjoyed. And your new version looks even better, the cover. But yeah, I also designed my own cover. Actually, this is a good point to actually hold up my book, but I am slightly embarrassed about it still, even though I have this desire for people to read it. Because the genre is romance, I just know that there's a lot of people who really won't like it at all. So I really don't want those people to read it.
Well, I mean, I haven't read that much romance, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm curious. I mean, something that you did really well, I think, was how you really did manage to do exactly what you were describing earlier. That at the end of each chapter, there's something that makes you want to just read the next chapter. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that. Like, how did you create that dynamic, or do you have a secret for how to do that?
There's a few things that I figured out about when I started writing fiction. I started really paying attention to what I liked about other fiction. So when I was watching TV or a film, or I was reading a book, and there was a really interesting, there's like like mindfulness. Like if you pay attention to what your brain is actually doing when you're experiencing things. Like if you're feeling depressed and you notice, oh, this is what it feels like to feel depressed. Well, I started watching myself when I was reading fiction or watching something and going like, when is the delight kicking in? Like actually paying attention to the moments where I felt some kind of frisson of delight, or anticipation, or a twinge of heartfelt sort of sincerity or anything. And I did come up with like a few rules for like what are the things that keep people interested, and I think it really comes down to expectation, where if you it's a thing about like even just like a sitcom or a sketch comedy, where there's a guy and he just walks in, and that he's holding, he's hiding something behind his back, and then someone else walks in and he's embarrassed about it, and he's hiding something, and you're just watching. You know exactly what's going to happen. You know that he's trying to hide it. You know the other person's about to see it. So either they're going to see it or they're not. And on an absolutely basic sort of standpoint, it's not actually that interesting. But the thing is that because you don't yet know exactly how it's going to turn out, even if you do know exactly how it's going to turn out, you're still expecting it to happen at every moment. You're watching these two people. One of them's hiding something. The other is oblivious or suspicious or whatever. And the very fact that you're just watching something, and you kind of have an expectation of what might happen, that for some reason I think interests people. Where you just have to keep setting up situations where the audience is just invited to speculate about what will happen next. That was at least one way I figured out how to do it.
Well, yeah, I found it quite good. I was reading Pride and Prejudice not at the same time. It was, I think, just before that or something like that. And I thought you were using some similar dynamics, and I thought it was really good. And it also, I had to think about it again. I recently, I don't know if you've heard the name George Saunders.
Yeah, I think so.
He wrote this book. I've got it in German because I'm borrowing it from a friend in German. In German, it's called, translated, it means swimming in the in the lake while it's raining or something like that. And he goes through a couple of like Russian short stories, and he also has this this description of how one can sort of sense when one is losing interest in the story. And so when one rereads and edits one's own story, one should like try to keep an eye on that gauge and make sure that it never goes too far in the like I'm bored direction or I'm overwhelmed direction on the other end, I guess. And you told me something similar at some point where you said you imagine it like a string. I don't know if you still think about it like that.
No, exactly. It's they say it's like tension. So when you think of like a thriller or like someone pointing a gun, that's tension. But really, that I think anything can be tension, where you're just being the reader is being pulled along by this string, and the tension is literally what is keeping them there. And they'll, if you lose the tension, they'll just like drift off, and they might keep reading, but they might just stop. And something I really wanted, I sent the book to loads of people, and I kept asking them, like, oh, it's fine if you get bored of it. Like, I expected people to get bored of it. I said, like, if you get bored of it, please just tell me, like, which page and which paragraph did you stop reading? Because I just wanted to know, like, when did I lose you? But I think people were just too polite, and they were always like, oh, no, yeah, I'll get to it. But I knew that a lot of people didn't read it or didn't finish it. And I just really wanted to know, like, exactly when did I lose their attention,
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I'm grateful because the reason I'm reading this book by George Saunders is I wrote a novella in German now recently that takes place in Leipzig, which I am now going to rewrite, which I also gave to a couple of people to read. And one of the people was like, I read it up to this certain point, and then you just lost me. It just became implausible. And they just stopped reading, and they couldn't carry on. And then they told me to read this book. So it's really interesting, and I'm really grateful for that experience, because I think, well, one has to be able to take the critique, but I think that's one of the most valuable things you can learn. And it's also made me restructure some of the House of Noth as well. So hopefully the new edition is a bit more effective in that department as well.
All right, I think, sorry to cut this short, but I think both of my daughters are now having some kind of meltdown upstairs, which is really not a good situation to throw my husband into. So I think we're going to have to cut the stream short, but thanks so much for joining me. I'm sorry we couldn't talk more. I might have to have you back another time. But really, I'm needed at home. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Phil, for coming on. Please go and read Phil's book, and there's a link in the description to follow what he's doing. And similarly, if you are interested in romance, do go and find my book. There's also an audiobook. Email me if you want to listen to the audiobook, because at the moment there's nowhere to buy it. But I don't want to just put it up as a video, because I'm just kind of embarrassed. So email me if you want to read the book on audio, or just go and buy it on Amazon. It's $1.99. Buy Phil's book, House of Noth. It's great. I loved it. And have a good night, everyone. Sorry, Phil.
That's all good. Thanks for having me.
Bye.